Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, we've spoken about various angles of what's happened in Afghanistan over the past 2 decades, as well as how the evacuation and withdrawal was carried out. And certainly no government, I don't think, who was involved, part of the coalition, comes out looking very, very nice, especially when it comes to the evacuation specifically of their respective citizens. There's a lot of criticism of many governments in that regard. And Canada is no stranger to that, although Canada, along with the NATO official role in Afghanistan, did walk away in 2014. It did remain certainly in another role, in a less military role, I should say, in Afghanistan through these years till just now, till the U.S. withdrawal took place. Now, there is an Angus Reid poll that was carried out in Canada, and we know that there are elections just around the corner in Canada, and this issue of the evacuation and how it was carried out, even by the Canadians, is also seemingly a significant enough election issue as well. So there's certainly a lot of criticism of the government in how it handled the evacuation, but then one of the interesting parts of this poll towards the end was then discussing what the future holds for Canadian foreign policy in general, and just how and what Canadians' opinion is on, the involvement in Afghanistan overall as well. So Canadians are more than twice as likely to say that Canada's role in the region should in fact end. However, they are divided. So, I mean, if you look at those numbers, there is division as well. And we will try to discuss all those discrepancies and divisions within Canadian society about that. But nevertheless, I would think that, as Joe Biden pointed out in his speech just not too many hours ago, discussing Afghanistan and the final withdrawal from there, that this also marks a different role that the U.S. hopes to take then around the world. Will the Canadians follow suit? It's not like the Canadians have been interventionist in the same regard as the U.S. anyhow. Let me put these points now to our esteemed panelists who are joining us from Canada today. We're now joined by Dr. Alistair Edgar, who is joining us from Kitchener, Ontario. He's an associate professor of political science at Wilfrid Laurier University. He's also the executive director of the Academic Council on the United Nations System. Joining us from Ottawa, Ontario, is Dr. Ferry de Kerckhove, who is a former ambassador of Canada. He's a senior fellow at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Ferry and Alistair, good morning to you both, and thank you both for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Ferry, I'd like to start with you. As I said, the evacuation is certainly one very important aspect. What happens to Afghans who worked with Canadian forces over the years, that's certainly another aspect as well, which is important. But I also then wonder what your thoughts are about in the macro issue of Canadian rule around the world. Has Afghanistan, had Canada's involvement there, changed people's minds?
First of all, I think that ever since the end of the regime of Prime Minister Harper, when we had Mr. Trudeau, there was a lot of hope that there was going to be a resurgence of the traditional Canadian role in foreign policy. Unfortunately, great promises were made by the Trudeau government, but we actually don't have a real foreign policy to speak of. We focused naturally on the US, but when it comes to the rest of the world, we have been very limited compared to the days of Axworthy or even the times of Joe Clark as foreign minister. So in a way, our departure in 2014 from Afghanistan militarily was the normal courses of event. And of course, now that we had to participate in the evacuation of Canadians and Afghan workers, we made an effort, but part of it within the coalition members. So I think the departure and the way we handled it, a bit like the poll says, it was not great, but we did what we could given the circumstance of the U.S. participation contribution. I think that Afghanistan raises much more broadly, what does Canada want to do on the international stage? And we haven't had that response since the first election of Mr. Trudeau. Foreign policy has disappeared. We're no longer considered as a major player. We do have some discussion with the Europeans on democracy and whatnot. But basically, I think Canada has become a very small country in foreign policy terms, in terms of explaining its broad interest. And at the same time, is still a major country in the world. We welcome refugees. We're doing our level best when it comes to climate and all that. But basically were absent from the real dialogues, even though we're in the G7, the G20. But we bring very little to the table, and so the public survey, the public opinion survey, only reflect a general weakness on foreign policy.
Alistair, I wonder what this is down to, right? About, as Ferry there correctly pointed out, certainly Trudeau, when he came into office, there was a lot of hope on the part of all of us Canadians, even those in the diaspora, that things would, that Canada would find its place within the international community, or would at least act out in ways that, Canadians, one would hope, would want the government and military to. What went wrong in that regard? Because I would think that policymakers are possibly still giving the correct kind of advice, or is that in fact what's missing? Is it incorrect policy making to begin with?
A little bit of everything. I'll just really quickly to mention, of course, and I try to remind folks when I'm talking to them here, before 9/11, I would say the vast majority of Canadians couldn't have found Afghanistan on a map, even if you pointed them to the region. And the interest now, when we left in 2014, there were no newspaper headlines, nothing reported about Afghanistan except for occasional, mass casualty events there from 2014 onwards. And most Canadians couldn't have told you anything about it again. So in terms of the focus on this issue, sadly, I think the next headline that hits the newspapers will take most Canadians' attention away, at least those who pay any attention at this point. Obviously, the Afghan diaspora here, Indian diaspora, Pakistani diaspora, others who have more personal connections will stay focused. But I don't think it's going to remain in the headlines. So COVID will probably replace it once again very quickly. On the bigger picture, I have to agree with Ferry. We had great hope that we might, in 2015, that Canada might return to a more activist foreign policy. I think one thing that counterfactually might have put us back in, and it didn't because we didn't make it, was to get a seat on the UN Security Council when Trudeau decided to run again. But we ran not a very convincing campaign. We had a long way to catch up with the other Western European competitors for that position. And having lost it for the second time, we didn't announce that we were going to start running again. The only thing that we've done, I think, that's constructive in that sense is the feminist foreign policy announcement. But that puts us alongside Sweden, the Netherlands, some other countries. And it's a granular thing. It's not really something that is making headlines on an international level. So, yeah, I think we've petered out. Now that may be, Ferry mentioned activism under Lloyd Axworthy. Maybe that was the exception, not the rule. Joe Clark too, but maybe exceptions, not the rule. And we're back to being the equivalent of the Netherlands and Belgium. This is where we're going to be settling at in terms of a foreign policy profile, which is very limited.
As you well know, I'm sure, as somebody who's been an ambassador in several key places around the world during your career so far, Canada has overall a fairly good reputation as a peace-loving country, et cetera, right? So what should Canadian foreign policy in the near future, midterm, long-term future look like? I mean, what needs to change about Canadian involvement that would be, for example, different from U.S. involvement? The reason I say that is because in many people's minds, as I'm sure you may possibly have faced this too during your tenure as ambassador, is that a lot of the times these sort of countries are grouped in as one, right? So whatever the U.S. will do, the Canadians will automatically do, and that's not certainly always the case.
Well, I think, first of all, the Trump years were a wake-up call that Canada discovered that when it was not in tune with the U.S. in a global way, not just on issue per issue, well, then we were a very, very small player. When we do something with the U.S. or the U.S. agrees with doing something with us, then we're successful. Axworthy actually managed to have a few things that the American didn't like the International Court, but basically, I think our problem is always the same. It's leadership. If you want to have a foreign policy as a country, you have to have a leader who has ideas and who's prepared to put forward those ideas and campaign for them. But there's a dearth of imagination. The Department of Foreign Affairs in Canada has become a program deliverer. And I'm not saying that the programs, the aid development, all that are not bad. But what I'm saying is there's not a thinking, an overarching interest expressed as Canadian, and there's so many issues on which we're mum. For instance, we don't talk to Russia. That was during Mrs. Freeland, but not talking to a country is not a foreign policy. We never say anything about the Middle East because we have no interest, seemingly, into what is happening with the Palestinian and everything that is going on. So there are issues we don't address. We do, as talked about, indeed. The feminine foreign policy, which is very nice. But he's absolutely right. It's granular, even though it's very important, because it's not the essence of foreign policy. Foreign policy is ideas, is real project, is liaison, consultation, doing things with others, but not just talking like, okay, let's talk about multilateralism. Yes, multilateralism is one of the key elements of what is Canadian about, but there's so little that is done in terms of even a rethink of what is today's multilateralism. And I think until we have a leadership that is interested in projecting what Canada is all about, we'll be a very small player, like my dear colleague just mentioned.
Alistair, I'm going to ask you sort of a repetitive question, but in another way, about the policy-making issue, because, I've consulted with Global Affairs Canada a few times as well, and it's not like there are not minds behind the scenes who know about the world around them and about better policy-making. I would think, at least for the people that I spoke to at Global Affairs during some of the time I spent in Ottawa as well. So I'm wondering, what then is going wrong? Is it that the establishment or the powers to be, I hate to use that phrase, but powers to be, for the lack of a better phrase, are not listening to the key policymakers? What's going wrong in that communication, I think?
As Ferry mentioned, and as you did also, there are very good, very professional, very knowledgeable people in global affairs, and we work with them quite often. But it's not really the job of, if you want, the civil service, the bureaucracy in global affairs to define policy. That's got to come from the leadership, from the political leadership, from the minister, from the prime minister, from cabinet. And that's where it doesn't exist. And one can understand some of this to some extent, not to excuse it, but to put it in a framework. Dealing with Trump and dealing with our vulnerability, economic and other vulnerability to Trump and a Republican Congress, absorbed huge amounts of energy and time in Ottawa. Currently, dealing with China and the difficult issues that we have to deal with China also take up a great deal of attention. And of course, like everywhere else, dealing with COVID takes up intellectual attention, mental attention, etc., from the political leadership. But global affairs, excellent people as they are, highly professional people as they are, need a framework. They need a foreign policy framework that's active and activist. And frankly, that is what we do not have. And it's not their job to provide it. Their job is to provide information, ideas, and to do the framework, but not to actually provide it. We simply don't have that. We have attention is everywhere else, but not on a foreign policy for Canada.
Ferry, would I be correct to say then, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, because you have a lot more, of course, experience in this regard, but is there a disconnect then between those people who actually work on the ground around the world via Global Affairs Canada or via respective embassies, and then those sitting in Ottawa? And I'm not saying that completely disconnected, but I'm just saying that, do you think there's that disconnect, which is also then adding to what we're seeing playing out?
We were lamenting the fact that in the days of Mr. Harper, the whole power was concentrated in the Prime Minister's office as opposed to the bureaucracy. And we were laughing when Mr. Trudeau arrived. He said, all that is over. Well, I think that the concentration of power is even more in the Prime Minister's office nowadays, because we have a Prime Minister who's a very nice man, but he doesn't have the intellectual depth that Mr. Harper had. And I disagreed with Mr. Harper on many things, but I can tell you, having worked directly with him as a Sherpa for la Francophonie, I admired his intelligence, the depth of his thought. So that's the difference. So, and a bit I can say is if we don't have a policy directive at the highest level, the bureaucracy is not going to follow. So, and I would say that the disconnect between, there's no disconnect between headquarters and missions abroad. I think they're all on the same page in lamenting the lack of ideas, the lack of initiatives. But we've become, as I said earlier, program deliverers as opposed to thinkers, and the disconnect is far more between a wall between the PMO and the rest of the foreign affairs establishment. And I think that's what is really critical. But it is also a sign of times where power is more and more concentrated in the highest level, as I call it, the Prime Minister's office, because the crises are such that, in fact, there's a lack of confidence. And, you know, when you have a leader who is not particularly policy-minded, he's actually scared about having ideas from anybody else than his inner circle. And that's where the disconnect lies.
Yeah. Well, the clock has gotten the best of us, unfortunately, but we really, really appreciate both Alistair and Ferry for taking their time out today to discuss this with us. You know, there's an image about Canada, as I said in one of my questions, as a peace-loving country, and all of that may be true, but then there's also this image that Canada is not important as a global player, and it certainly can be if it so wants to be, as both of our guests are discussed, and they've been influential in their own respective regards when it comes to that arena in Canada as well as overseas. So it's not always about just following the United States, just like we discuss, and we will discuss in our next segment about the EU role as well. It's not always about just following the United States. It's about independent policymaking and about following policies that the people really want implemented around the world. A feminist policy, as Alistair there pointed out, or otherwise an activist policy, as Ferry there called it, whatever we want to call it. But there needs to be a role for a country that is important like Canada, but isn't yet seen as actually influential in the world, be it when it comes to Canada, be it when it comes to Afghanistan, I should say, in fact, or other very important key crises points around the world. I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss another angle of the Afghanistan crisis and the lessons that may have been learned by all the players who were involved in Afghanistan over these years. And one of those lessons seems to be on the part of the European Union, at least on the part of Joseph Borrell, who is an EU official, that the EU must push ahead with its European Rapid Reaction Force, which, by the way, has already been formed, but then there's just disagreements among member states about how and when to then deploy this force. There was talk about it back in 1999 during the Kosovo crisis, and then in 2007 there was finally the formation of a force of some sort, but then in the ensuing years, as I said, there has been disagreement. What exactly would the form of that sort of deployment be on the part of the EU in an ideal world? What was Mr. Borrell pointing at that the EU would have done differently when it comes to Afghanistan? There is a lot of talk, certainly, about European concerns about refugees that would be coming in. Is that what he is referring to? Because there are national security or bloc security concerns, I should say, in that regard. Europe and the United States seem to have significant differences as well about the way the U.S. left Afghanistan. So is this then a sign that EU is seeking to at least branch away from the U.S. and not be as dependent on the U.S. when it comes to its defense and overseas security/military needs through NATO or otherwise? Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Michele Groppi, who is a teaching fellow of Challenges to the International Order at Defense Studies Department at the King's College London. He's joining us today from Verona in Italy. Joining us from Rome in Italy is Dr. Valerio Alfonso Bruno, who is a senior fellow and researcher at the University of Freiburg. And joining us from Sofia, Bulgaria is Dr. Luca Ratti, who is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Rome III. He's also an adjunct professor at the American University of Rome and a visiting scholar at the EU Security Carleton University. Luca, Valerio, and Michele. Thank you to all three of you for joining us today. Luca, I'd like to start with you. Does the EU need, or should it have, in fact, let me put it this way, should it have deployed the Rapid Reaction Force in this case when it came to Afghanistan?
Well, it is a very complex question what the EU needs when it comes to security. And it would be nice to see the European Union being able somehow to make its impact felt on regions as far as away as Afghanistan. But let's not forget that we've seen like EU leaders talk about a security and defense force roughly for the last 30 years, beginning with the disintegration of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. If you want to, not to mention or not to forget, at least the decisions or the talks that were made already during the Cold War. And still we haven't seen the EU being able to make any difference, not even as close as to Libya, to Italy's borders, or to the Balkans in the 1990s. So I think that to talk about a new defense force deployed in Afghanistan remains so far maybe a prospect that the EU decision makers may talk about, but not a realistic possibility, I'm afraid.
What are your thoughts about that? Does the EU even have the capability and the sort of unity that one would need to be able to deploy a force, to be able to support each other enough to even form a strong such defense force?
Fortunately, I have to say I agree with my colleague. I mean, the capability could be there, but there is no willingness to take, the action. First of all, there is no political a political executive could be leading let's call an European army. So without this kind of real political executive backing, any military solution is not possible. It's not about resources, because countries like Italy, Germany, France, etc., they have all the resources. The peacekeeping missions have been also very good. You see Italy, for instance, the Italian missions. The problem is political. And I'm also, unfortunately, very skeptical towards the dependence of the European Union, or let's say the European Union member states, towards the US. There is a lot of talks about getting independent, getting adult and build its own military force, but still we are we want to be dependent, let's say, to the US.
Michele, what are your thoughts about that? But dependence on the U.S. is what really hurts the EU, doesn't it? I mean, even in this case, there is a lot of concern about refugees, asylum seekers coming on European shores, and that's been an issue for a while now, even with the Syria crisis. So, I mean, it seems like with the EU continuing to sort of, I wouldn't say piggyback, but maybe I will use that term for a little bit, piggyback on the U.S. policies, that sort of just hurts it. I mean, it really needs independent policymaking in this regard, doesn't it?
Thank you, Waqar, and thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, you're absolutely right. We're not united. We are trying to distantiate ourselves a little bit more from the United States, but at the same time, there's still a reality check at the end of the day. And even as a teaching fellow at the Defense Academy of the United Kingdom, we are actually having this talk quite a bit. Right. So as for the role of a potential European army, of a potential EU army, and now that, look, I do not want to complicate the picture even more, but even with Brexit happening right now, this is a question that we have to address. Because even the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom, we could argue, is seen some very troublesome times. And therefore, are we investing in a somewhat of a European army to, as I was saying, right, to acquire a little bit more autonomy, or are we still so much dependent on Washington to the point that even our foreign policy is somewhat jeopardized? It is a debate, a live debate. Hopefully, we will see this develop in the upcoming months. But yes, it is absolutely something that we have to keep an eye on.
Luca, what is the alternative? I wonder. If there is disagreement between the United States and the EU on certain key security issues. I mean, we can even talk about the Iran nuclear deal, for example, throw that into the mix, because there seems to be disagreement between the two sides in certain regards on that issue as well. That's certainly a security issue for the EU, considering it's geographically closer to Iran. So if anything goes wrong there, it'll affect it a lot more. I mean, what's holding the EU back? Why can't it put its act together and get this done?
Well, I think, as my colleagues, both of them emphasize, the first problem is political. There is lack of political unity among the EU members, and EU members have been struggling to reach political unity on security and defense issues for roughly 70 years, but still they couldn't come to the final decision of setting up like a new military force, and I certainly will not talk about a new army. Unity was easier to reach, I believe, during the Cold War, but again, as my colleagues emphasized, then NATO took care of European security, and somehow the European countries could, let's say, not consider defense as a major concern because the United States was doing most of the job. Then since the 1990s, and as you said a few minutes ago, 1999 Kosovo crisis was also like a crucial moment, the Europeans have started to really discuss, again, issues relating to their own security and defense. But as long as NATO was there, as long as NATO is there, I think Europe has always felt somehow that it didn't need to accelerate or to do that extra mile, that it would bring about political unity, the political unity necessary for European defense. And for the future, I don't see this happening, as I said a few minutes ago, but I believe maybe a path that the EU members will continue to follow is the one of coalitions of the willing. We will see a group of EU members acting together, maybe even outside of the EU framework, as France has been doing on a number of occasions. And I'm afraid this is the only realistic way that the EU will be able to pursue in the future.
So then, Valerio, it's down to, am I right to say, individual member EU countries then to decide what they do militarily? I mean, we know France is already involved overseas in a number of places, or has been, especially in Africa. Is that just the way this is going to go? I mean, with individual countries who have the ability, then will get involved to deal with their own national security reasons?
Yes. It was always the case in the past like that, like union à la carte, especially for military issues. So I don't see something changing in the future. And as I told you earlier, it's not for I don't see it for a lack of resources, of capabilities. It's more about not really looking for a political unity, even because it can be convenient to be united under some aspects and to be more, like independent, being back on the national sovereignty for other aspects. And the same goes for the immigration. There's been a lot of talk with the possibility to implement different strategies with agencies like Frontex. But to be honest, not a lot has been done, and I don't see in the close future something going into this direction. Unfortunately, I remember it since many years. I was younger. I was reading like scholars writing in the future, in 10, 20 years, we will have a sort of European army, easy to deploy capabilities, but after 20 years, nothing of that has happened. It was a sort of daydreaming. And I think because there is really no willingness to have a greater political and, of course, military union.
I wonder, in the hypothetical situation that the EU were to get its act together and really make this sort of thing happen, do you think that its policy making in how it would get involved overseas would be, for lack of a better word, more responsible, considering, again, if anything does happen, for example, in the Middle East, it's a lot is a lot more geographically closer to the EU than, for example, the United States. So the effects are sort of immediately felt, or very soon at least, via refugees or asylum seekers at the very least. Do you think that the EU would be more responsible in that regard? Do you think that even those individual countries that we can talk about are viewing Afghanistan or any such other conflict or crisis with a lot more hesitancy because of how the effect plays out for them?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So it's an interesting one. Historically speaking, even though I do not like making decisions, but just for the sake of it, let's just say that strategically speaking, countries like, for instance, the United Kingdom arguably has much more experience than the United States. And so, especially in these months, so much talk has been going on in London, at the Defence Academy, at King's, at other universities, pretty much virtually anticipating everything, literally everything that is happening right now in Afghanistan. I'm not saying that the United States is not capable of doing that. Absolutely not. They are, of course. But both for a geographical reason and for a historical reason, I think that, yes, we could probably go that far and say that Europe could act slightly more responsible. There's a big caveat, though, and it is, as we were saying, political divisiveness, so we're not united, and single countries have obviously different goals, different agendas. And so I imagine, just as it happened at the very beginning of the Syrian crisis, in which some countries, I'm not going to say that they cherry-picked the people who they really wanted the most, but I can definitely see France doing one thing, Italy doing the other thing, Germany doing one thing, and then blaming each other, just like we have been doing. So to answer your question, I think that there is a potential to do better. But we are in need of much soul searching before we embark on something like this. We have committed incredible mistakes in the past. We have to, be cognizant of those, and hopefully we can do something good.
Luca, what about again, it's very hard to generalize. As Michele there said, Europe is a huge bloc, certainly. So there are a lot of citizens we can talk about of the EU bloc. But do you think the people also aren't sort of on board on this idea? I mean, or do the people not even really care?
Well, I don't think EU defense has been like a major issue for the European public. And you rarely see it featuring prominently like in EU elections, for example, or in domestic elections within member states, not even like in EU parliamentary elections. I think there is awareness about the European people, certainly across the 27 members, about the need somehow to get that Europe gets its act together. But when it comes to security and defense, I fear, again, that there is not like a key concern among European public opinion. And again, now with the rise of populism in the last few years, I'm sure there'll be a number of parties that will try to keep defending national sovereignty and add to those resistances that so far certainly slowed down this process and prevented Europe substantially from making a true impact in international affairs and having to rely continuously on the United States and NATO.
What are your thoughts about that and on where the people stand? And I would think that, as Luca there mentioned, the rise of populism across the bloc isn't helping, right? But at the same time, I'm trying to think of, what kind of an alternative even populists have in this case. I mean, how are they expecting to then keep their respective countries safe?
At least from the Italian perspective, there's not a debate about military issue, or let's call it an European Union army. As concerned the possibility in the future, I guess would take like crisis which come from close to the European borders, and with the US perhaps disengaging a bit. That would be the rationale to push the European EU member states and their people to get to the awareness to have a proper European army. As concerned populism, for sure, especially far-right populism party, they will push to keep having sovereignty upon military issues. And then I also think that from an economic point of view, financial point of view, in the future, when we will have really clear the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the toll of the pandemic in Europe, because still now we are in a sort of, let's say, emergency and sanitary phases, even if it's almost 2 years we have been dealing with the pandemic. So when the toll will be there, I don't see all this possibility to really have resources to pull together and to have a European army. There will be more cogent issues like employment, development, perhaps migration, hopefully.
Michele, you know, what wonder is, again, I've spoken about the cause and effect issue here, right? So, I mean, to me, it's always seemed logical that if something is happening so close to Europe, that there will be an effect on it. And so I'm wondering, is this, as Valerio and Luca, they pointed out, a situation where people are just more distracted with other issues, such as, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic effect that that's had really around the world, but especially in Europe as well, that they are not then concentrating on the fact that, hey, foreign policy making is actually really, really important, and then by default, defense policy making. I mean, I'm just having a hard time understanding why this isn't a bigger issue for Europeans.
Look, once again, I know that the United Kingdom is not in the European Union anymore, but we're talking about this every single day pretty much. And it goes back also to civil-military relations. After 2 world wars, in which millions of people died, in which militarization has pretty much ruined societies, societies which have witnessed the emergence of totalitarianism and something like that, we're still hurting pretty bad. And so selling, marketing, defense, even in a, quote, fashionable way, looking abroad, a lot of people still make that comparison to, as I was saying, militarization, imperialism, colonialism. It brings back very painful memories. I think that we still we need to strike a balance. We need to recognize our past, but we need to grow out of it because the world is counting on us, and we have to decide what we want to be or where we want to be when we grow up. Either still dependent on the United States, or maybe verging towards Russia or China, or being pretty much locked up in a museum. So we have to decide. And I think that a lot here is to be said as to how armed forces are viewed. Once again, not making generalizations, but in my country, if you join the military forces, you're a fascist, you're a gun nut, which obviously is nothing further from the truth. But we lost that culture. I'm not arguing that we should go back to 50 or 60 years ago. Nothing further from what I'm trying to say. But we must strike a better balance. What are armed forces for? How can they be used for good, or at least like what we think good is in this sense, and in a much more communal European way.
I'll just give you the final word. Where does this leave NATO then? Should NATO be worried?
Well, I don't think NATO has much to worry as yet, if not from the attitude of the United States. I don't think the Europeans, they pose any significant rivalry or threat to NATO for the time being. And all the time that France has tried somehow to present European defense as an alternative to NATO, those French decision makers that have followed that path, and I would argue maybe more recently even Macron, when he spoke about a NATO that was going to be dead in a cerebral way, they have ended up remaining isolated in Europe. So I don't see enough political consensus within the European Union to call into question NATO's role, and not even in France, I would argue. And to conclude briefly, I think that we just need to compare developments in security and defense with the entire trajectory of the European Union. I mean, the European Union came about in its early days as a big project to deal, of course, with the consequences of the war in Europe, with reconstruction, but with the problem of Germany. And without Germany, there wouldn't be a European economic bloc substantially. And until the Germans don't clearly decide what they want to do with their own security and defense, we're not going to see like a bloc acting in a significant manner on these issues. So I'm afraid, as much as the partnership between France and Germany was decisive to launch the European Economic and Steel Community, European Coal and Steel Community in the early 1950s, the partnership between France and Germany will be decisive also to decide the future path of the European security and defense policy, especially now that the British, certainly they remain in Europe politically, but they are no longer part of the European Union.
Very well. We'll leave that as a final comment, but we really appreciate Luca, Valerio, and Michele for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise with us. We really understood the context here, right? So the issue is political, as all three of our guests there agreed, in Europe, and there's a significant numbers of reasons for that. So there's, of course, the rise of populism, which then, of course, means that individual countries, politicians then want to prioritize their own national sovereignty when it comes to their defense policy making. There is the COVID-19 pandemic. There is the Syrian refugee crisis, which occurred, and the lessons or not that we'll learn from that, and the hardening of positions in that regard as well, and just overall dependence on the United States in many, many regards when it comes to foreign policies, especially when it comes to military interventions around the world. It just seems like Europe follows, unfortunately, in that regard, as much as Europe wants to claim that it takes independent decisions in that regard. It may in certain regards, I'm generalizing certainly, but overall the image is not of European leadership in this regard, but Europe sort of just following the United States into whatever next war zone it may decide to go into. And that certainly is a disappointing position, I would think, for Europeans themselves to also find themselves in. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.